The morning sun cast a golden glow over London as the city awakened to one of the most significant days in British history. Streets that were usually bustling with the regular rhythm of daily life now hummed with an entirely different energy. Thousands of people had camped overnight along the procession route, wrapped in Union Jack flags and clutching their thermoses of tea, determined to witness history unfold before their eyes. Inside Kensington Palace, the Prince and Princess of Wales were already awake long before dawn broke. Catherine had been up since the early hours, her mind racing through the countless details that needed to fall perfectly into place. This was not just any royal engagement. This was the coronation of King Charles III, and as the future king and queen consort, William and Catherine knew the world would be watching their every move, analyzing every gesture, every expression. The children's nanny had helped prepare Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis the night before, laying out their ceremonial outfits with meticulous care. George, at 9 years old, was old enough to understand the gravity of the occasion. He had been unusually quiet during breakfast, his young face showing signs of the weight he already carried as second in line to the throne. Charlotte, always poised beyond her years, sat with perfect posture, occasionally glancing at her reflection in the polished silver of the breakfast service. Louis, the youngest and most spirited of the three, bounced with barely contained energy, his excitement threatening to spill over at any moment. Catherine moved through the palace rooms with practiced grace, checking on each child personally despite having a full team of staff at her disposal. She understood that on a day like this they needed their mother's reassuring presence more than ever. She knelt beside George, adjusting his collar and speaking to him in low, encouraging tones. The boy looked up at her with eyes that mirrored his father's, seeking strength and reassurance. She squeezed his hand gently, a silent promise that she would be right there beside him through every moment of this historic day. William stood by the tall windows of their private sitting room, looking out at the gathering crowds in the distance. His formal military uniform had been pressed to perfection, each medal and decoration positioned exactly as protocol demanded. Yet, despite the magnificence of his appearance, there was a vulnerability in his stance that only those who knew him well would recognize. This was his Father's Day, a moment Charles had waited decades to experience. William felt the complex mixture of pride, duty, and the bittersweet passage of time that such occasions inevitably brought. The sounds of the palace coming fully to life echoed through the corridors. Staff members moved with purposeful efficiency, coordinating timing down to the minute. Security personnel conducted final sweeps, their earpieces crackling with constant updates. Outside, the Metropolitan Police had deployed thousands of officers along the route to Westminster Abbey, managing what was predicted to be the largest security operation in British history. Catherine finally emerged from the children's rooms, her own preparation complete. She wore an elegant ivory silk crepe dress and matching cape by Alexander McQueen, the same designer who had created her wedding dress 12 years earlier. The choice was deliberate, a subtle nod to continuity and tradition. Her headpiece, a silver bullion and crystal embroidered piece by Jess Collette, caught the morning light streaming through the windows. Around her neck hung the George VI festoon necklace on loan from the king, a powerful symbol of the family's trust and the historical weight of the moment. When William turned from the window and saw his wife, time seemed to pause for just a heartbeat. After years of marriage and 3 children, she still had the power to take his breath away. But it was more than her beauty that struck him in that moment. It was her strength, her unwavering commitment to their family and their duty, her ability to make even the most daunting occasions feel manageable simply by standing beside him. The children were brought together for a final inspection before departure. George wore his Hainsworth Garter blue doeskin tunic with specially designed regalia. Charlotte looked like a young princess from a storybook in her ivory silk dress with matching cape and a delicate headpiece of silver leaves. Even Louis, despite his tendency toward mischief, looked remarkably composed in his miniature ceremonial outfit. A palace aide appeared at the door, giving a respectful nod. It was time. The cars were ready, the route was secured, and Westminster Abbey awaited. Catherine took one last look at her children, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and protectiveness. She knew the cameras would capture every second, that their images would be analyzed and discussed for years to come. But in this moment, before they stepped out into the public eye, They were simply a family preparing to support their grandfather and king. William placed his hand on George's shoulder, a gesture of both guidance and solidarity. The boy straightened his already perfect posture, lifting his chin slightly. Catherine saw the transformation in her son, watched as he consciously stepped into his role, however young he might be. It was a glimpse into the future, a preview of the man and the king he would one day become. They descended the grand staircase together, their footsteps echoing in the vast entrance hall. Staff members lined the corridors, offering respectful nods as the family passed. Outside, the distinctive sound of the waiting motorcade engines could be heard, a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very stones of the palace. As they stepped through the palace doors into the carefully controlled chaos of the departure area, the reality of the day fully settled upon them. This was history in the making, and they were not merely witnesses but essential participants in a ceremony that stretched back over 1,000 years of British monarchy. The journey to Westminster Abbey would take them through streets lined with well-wishers, past landmarks steeped in royal history, toward a ceremony that would define this new era of the monarchy. As their car began to move, pulling away from Kensington Palace, Catherine reached for William's hand, their fingers intertwining in a gesture hidden from the cameras but solid as stone. Whatever this day would bring, they would face it together, as they always had, as they always would. The royal motorcade glided through the streets of London with practiced precision, each vehicle positioned exactly as protocol demanded. Inside the lead car, William and Catherine sat with their 3 children, the weight of countless eyes upon them even through the tinted windows. The crowds had swelled far beyond what anyone had predicted, with estimates suggesting over 1 million people had descended upon the capital city for this historic occasion. George sat between his parents, his small hands folded neatly in his lap. Every few moments he would glance out the window at the sea of faces, flags, and cameras. Catherine noticed his fingers occasionally twitching, a nervous habit he had developed during particularly stressful public appearances. She gently placed her hand over his, a subtle reminder that she was there, that he was not alone in this overwhelming experience. Charlotte and Louis sat across from their parents, their faces pressed close to the windows. Charlotte waved with the practiced grace of someone who had been doing this her entire young life, her smile never wavering even as the journey continued. Louis, true to his spirited nature, alternated between enthusiastic waves and making faces at particularly excited children in the crowd. Drawing a gentle but firm warning glance from his father, the route had been planned meticulously, taking them past some of London's most iconic landmarks. As they passed Buckingham Palace, the official residence of the monarch, William felt a complex mixture of emotions wash over him. His grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II, had lived there for most of her reign. The palace had been a constant in his life, a place of both formal duty and private family moments. Now his father would call it home, another sign of the relentless march of time and the changing of the guard. Catherine watched her husband's face, reading the emotions there as clearly as if he had spoken them aloud. She had learned over the years to understand his silences, his subtle shifts in expression. She knew he was thinking of his grandmother, of his mother, of the complicated legacy he would one day inherit. Without drawing attention, she shifted slightly closer to him, her shoulder pressing against his in silent support. The cheers from the crowd grew louder as they approached the historic heart of London. People had climbed lampposts and traffic signals, perched precariously to catch a glimpse of the passing motorcade. Union Jack flags rippled in the spring breeze, creating waves of red, white, and blue that stretched as far as the eye could see. Many in the crowd had been waiting since the previous evening, camping on the pavements, sharing thermoses of coffee and tea, bound together by their collective desire to witness this moment in history. Inside Westminster Abbey, preparations had reached a fever pitch of activity. The ancient church, which had witnessed coronations for nearly 1,000 years, was being transformed into the stage for this most sacred of British ceremonies. Florists added final touches to elaborate displays, their flowers chosen to represent all corners of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth. Television crews made last-minute adjustments to their equipment, knowing that billions of people around the world would be watching through their lenses. Distinguished guests from around the globe had already begun to arrive, each entrance carefully choreographed and timed. World leaders, foreign royalty, and representatives from the Commonwealth nations filed into the Abbey, their presence a testament to the enduring influence of the British monarchy. The Abbey's soaring Gothic architecture provided a dramatic backdrop, its ancient stones having absorbed centuries of prayers, music, and momentous occasions. As the Wales family's car finally approached Westminster Abbey, a palpable shift in energy could be felt. The casual excitement of the street crowds gave way to the more controlled atmosphere of the official ceremony space. Security presence intensified, with officers positioned at every possible vantage point. The media pen, carefully positioned to capture arrivals, bristled with cameras and reporters speaking urgently into microphones in dozens of languages. The car came to a smooth stop at the designated arrival point. For a brief moment, the family sat in stillness, a final bubble of privacy before they would step into the unrelenting glare of public scrutiny. William turned to look at each of his children, his gaze lingering on George the longest. The boy met his father's eyes with a courage that belied his years. Giving a small, determined nod, a footman opened the door, and the sounds of the crowd immediately flooded into the car's quiet interior. William emerged first, straightening his uniform and offering his hand to Catherine. She took it, stepping out with fluid grace, her ivory ensemble catching the filtered light beneath the Abbey's entrance canopy. The crowd's cheers reached a crescendo as she appeared, the cameras capturing every angle of her arrival. George followed next, his young face composed into an expression of solemn dignity. He had been coached extensively on the protocol, on where to stand, how to walk, when to bow. But no amount of coaching could fully prepare a 9-year-old boy for the reality of millions of eyes watching his every move, for the knowledge that he was not just attending his grandfather's coronation, but representing the future of the institution itself. Charlotte emerged with her characteristic poise, immediately catching sight of the cameras and offering a small, perfect smile. She had always possessed an innate understanding of what was expected of her, an ability to balance being a normal child with being a princess that sometimes astonished even her parents. Louis came last, his energy barely contained, his eyes wide as he took in the magnificent scene before him. Abbey officials stood ready to guide them, their faces professionally neutral, but their eyes revealing their awareness of the historical significance of this moment. The processional route through the Abbey had been practiced numerous times, but the reality of doing it with the weight of the world's attention was something entirely different. As they prepared to enter the Abbey itself, Catherine bent down slightly to adjust Charlotte's cape, a motherly gesture that humanized the otherwise formal tableau. William placed a guiding hand on Louis's shoulder, a gentle reminder to maintain decorum. George stood slightly apart, already beginning to understand that his position required a certain distance, a certain formality that his siblings might not yet fully bear. The great doors of Westminster Abbey stood open before them, revealing the soft glow of candlelight within, and the sounds of the organ beginning the processional music. The scent of flowers and ancient stone drifted out to meet them. Inside waited 2,000 guests, television cameras broadcasting to billions, and a ceremony that would crown a new king and reshape the monarchy for a new generation. Catherine took one final deep breath, feeling the corset of her formal dress, the weight of her jewelry, the responsibility of her role. She glanced at William, saw the same mixture of pride and duty reflected in his eyes. This was what they had been preparing for their entire lives, what their children were now being prepared for in turn. The monarchy was not just about grand ceremonies and glittering crowns. It was about continuity, about service, about carrying forward a tradition while adapting it for modern times. Together, the family of 5 stepped forward, crossing the threshold from the bright spring morning into the hallowed, ancient space of Westminster Abbey. Behind them, the doors remained open, allowing shafts of natural light to illuminate their path forward, a symbolic bridge between the past they honored and the future they represented. The moment they crossed the threshold into Westminster Abbey, the atmosphere shifted entirely. The cacophony of the outside crowds faded to a distant murmur, replaced by the resonant tones of the organ and the hushed whispers of 2,000 guests. The Abbey's soaring ceiling seemed to stretch endlessly upward, its Gothic arches creating shadows and light in equal measure. Centuries of history pressed down from every carved stone, every ancient monument, every memorial to kings and queens long departed. William felt the familiar weight settle onto his shoulders, the one he always experienced in this sacred space. He had been here many times before for ceremonies both joyous and heartbreaking. His mother's funeral had been held here, a memory that still had the power to steal his breath if he dwelt on it too long. But today was different. Today was about his father, about the continuation of their family's 1,000-year legacy, about the future rather than the past. Catherine's trained eye swept across the assembled guests as they proceeded down the aisle. She recognized faces from all corners of the globe, world leaders she had met at state dinners, members of European royal families, representatives from Commonwealth nations still loyal to the crown. Every pew was filled. Every eye turned toward their small procession. The weight of their collective attention was almost physical, pressing against her from all sides. George walked with measured steps, his posture rigid with concentration. He had practiced this walk dozens of times in the long corridors of Kensington Palace, counting steps in his head, maintaining perfect pace. But practice could not replicate the reality of this moment. The Abbey seemed impossibly vast, the aisle impossibly long. He could feel his heart hammering in his chest, could hear the blood rushing in his ears beneath the organ music. But he kept walking, kept his chin up, kept his expression neutral, because that was what was expected of him. Charlotte moved with a grace that seemed almost effortless, though she too had practiced extensively. She had asked her mother countless questions in the weeks leading up to this day. What if I trip? What if Charlotte? What if Louis does something embarrassing? Catherine had patiently answered each concern, reassuring her daughter while also preparing her for the reality that sometimes things did go wrong, and the true measure of a princess was how she handled those unexpected moments. Louis, bless him, was doing remarkably well considering his age and temperament. He walked between his siblings, occasionally glancing up at the magnificent stained glass windows that bathed the Abbey in pools of colored light. Once or twice his attention wavered, drawn to a particularly ornate monument or an unexpected movement in the crowd. But a gentle guiding hand from William kept him on track. The Abbey choir's voices rose in perfect harmony, filling the ancient space with sound so pure it seemed to transcend the physical world. The coronation anthem had been performed at these ceremonies for generations, its Latin words unchanged, its melody a direct link to coronations past. Catherine felt goosebumps rise on her arms despite the warmth of her formal cape. There was something profoundly moving about being part of a ritual that stretched back through the centuries, about standing where countless others had stood before them. As they approached their designated seats, Catherine could see King Charles and Queen Camilla already in position. Charles looked magnificent in his robes of state, but she could also see the emotion flickering across his face as he watched his son and grandchildren approach. He had waited 7 decades for this moment, had endured criticism and scandal, had rebuilt his reputation through years of dedicated service. Now, at 74 years old, he would finally assume the role he had been preparing for his entire life. William caught his father's eye as they drew near, and something unspoken passed between them. Pride certainly and love, but also an understanding of the burden they both carried, the crown that could never truly be set down once assumed. Charles's expression softened almost imperceptibly as his gaze shifted to his grandchildren, taking in George's solemn face, Charlotte's perfect composure, Louis's barely contained energy. The family took their seats in the specifically designated area, positioned where they would have clear view of the ceremony, but would not overshadow the main participants. Palace officials had debated the exact positioning for weeks, understanding that every detail would be analyzed and interpreted. Too prominent, and it might seem like William was overshadowing his father's moment. Too distant, and it might suggest a family rift that tabloids would eagerly exploit. Around them, other members of the royal family were also taking their places. Extended family members, some whom William saw only at major ceremonial occasions, nodded greetings. There was an odd mixture of the deeply personal and the intensely public about these gatherings. They were family, connected by blood and shared history, yet they could never forget that they were also an institution, a symbol of national identity and continuity. The ceremony itself began with a series of rituals that had been performed at every coronation since time immemorial. The recognition, where the Archbishop of Canterbury presented the sovereign to the people in 4 directions, asking for their consent and allegiance. The oath, where Charles swore to govern according to law and justice, to maintain the Church of England, to uphold the rights and freedoms of his people. His voice was strong and clear as he made these solemn promises, each word carrying the weight of sacred commitment. George watched intently, understanding that he was witnessing what he himself would one day experience. His father had explained it to him gently but honestly. This crown would pass from his grandfather to his father and then, eventually, to him. The knowledge sat heavy on his young shoulders, but he did not shy away from it. His parents had raised him to understand duty, to accept responsibility, to see his privilege as inseparable from his obligation to serve. When the anointing occurred, the most sacred part of the ceremony, a screen was brought forward to shield the moment from direct view. It was the only part of the coronation considered too holy for public observation, a direct connection between the sovereign and the divine. Catherine watched the screen being positioned, understanding the symbolism. The claim to rule by divine right that the monarchy still maintained even in this secular age. The moment of crowning itself sent a ripple through the congregation. The Archbishop lifted St. Edward's crown, the same crown used at every coronation since 1661, its gold frame adorned with precious stones that caught the light in dazzling displays. The crown was placed upon Charles's head, and in that instant everything changed. He was no longer simply Charles, Prince of Wales, waiting patiently in his mother's long shadow. He was King Charles III, sovereign of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth realms, defender of the faith, head of state. William felt the shift viscerally. His father was now his king, his sovereign to whom he owed allegiance and fealty. But Charles was also still his father, the man who had raised him, who had tried to prepare him for this impossible life. The dual nature of their relationship had always existed, but in this moment, it crystallized into something sharper, more defined. The abbey erupted in voices as the congregation proclaimed their recognition and allegiance. The words echoed off the ancient stones, layering upon themselves, creating a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Catherine felt tears prick at her eyes, though she blinked them away quickly, knowing the cameras were always watching, always recording. Charlotte reached for her mother's hand, her own small fingers squeezing tightly. Catherine squeezed back, grateful for the connection, for the reminder that amid all this ceremony and symbolism, they were still a family. Louis leaned against his father, his earlier energy finally beginning to wane after hours of enforced stillness. William wrapped an arm around his youngest son, a protective gesture that spoke of love and reassurance. The ceremony continued with the presentation of the royal regalia, each item heavy with symbolism and history. The orb, representing Christian sovereignty over the world. The scepters, symbols of temporal and spiritual authority. The ring, signifying the monarch's marriage to their nation. Each object was lifted high for all to see before being presented to the newly crowned king. And with each presentation, the reality of this transformation became more concrete. Catherine studied her father-in-law's face as he received each sacred object. Charles had always been a man of deep feeling, sometimes to his detriment in the eyes of a public that preferred their royals to be stoic and unreadable. But she could see him struggling to maintain his composure now, his eyes glistening with unshed tears, his hands trembling slightly as they closed around the scepter. This was the culmination of a lifetime of waiting, of preparation, of dedication to a role he had no choice but to accept. Queen Camilla was crowned shortly after, in a ceremony less elaborate than her husband's but no less significant. She wore Queen Mary's crown, modified to include the Cullinan 3, I4, and V diamonds. Catherine watched as the crown was placed upon Camilla's head, thinking about the long and complicated journey this woman had taken to reach this moment. Vilified for years, blamed for the breakdown of Charles's marriage to Diana, Camilla had slowly and patiently rebuilt her reputation through quiet, consistent service. William's feelings about his stepmother had evolved over the years, though it had been a difficult journey. The wounds of his parents' broken marriage had run deep, and his loyalty to his mother's memory remained fierce. But he had come to recognize Camilla's genuine love for his father, her stabilizing influence, her willingness to accept the burden of public service without complaint. She would never be his mother, but she was his father's wife, and she made Charles happy in a way Diana never had. George shifted in his seat, trying to find a more comfortable position without appearing restless. His formal outfit, while magnificent, was not designed for extended periods of sitting. He could feel the collar of his tunic pressing against his neck, could feel sweat beginning to form beneath the heavy fabric. But complaining was not an option. Not here, not now. He had been taught from his earliest memories that being royal meant putting duty before personal comfort, service before self. Around them, the congregation rose and fell in waves, standing for certain portions of the ceremony, sitting for others, kneeling for prayers. The coordinated movement of 2,000 people created its own kind of rhythm, a physical manifestation of collective participation in this historic event. Catherine moved through each transition with practiced grace, helping Louis when he became confused about whether to stand or sit, giving Charlotte an encouraging smile when she caught her daughter's questioning glance. The music swelled again, this time for the national anthem in honor of the newly crowned king. Every voice in the abbey joined in, the familiar words taking on new meaning in this transformed context. God save the king, rather than God save the queen for the first time in over 70 years. William sang along, his voice blending with his family's, with the congregation's, feeling the weight of history and the promise of the future converging in this single moment. When the homily began, delivered by the Archbishop of Canterbury, the assembled guests settled into attentive silence. The Archbishop spoke of service and duty, of the sacred trust between sovereign and subjects, of the need for leadership rooted in compassion and wisdom. His words were carefully chosen, meant to reassure a nation uncertain about the transition from a beloved queen who had reigned for 7 decades to a king still proving himself in the role he had inherited. Catherine found herself reflecting on the themes of the homily, applying them not just to Charles but to their entire family. Service had defined their lives, had shaped every decision, every sacrifice, every moment of privacy surrendered to public scrutiny. She and William had given up any possibility of a normal life, had raised their children in the constant glare of media attention, had accepted that they would always belong to their country before they belonged to themselves. There were times, in the quiet moments late at night, when she wondered if it was fair to George, Charlotte, and Louis. They had not chosen this life, had not asked to be born into this particular family with its impossible expectations and relentless pressure. She and William tried to give them as normal a childhood as possible, sending them to regular schools, encouraging ordinary friendships, allowing them to play and be silly and make mistakes away from the cameras. But there was no escaping what they were, what they would one day become. George, especially, bore a burden his siblings did not fully share. As second in line to the throne, his future was largely predetermined. He would be king one day whether he wanted it or not, whether he felt ready or not. Catherine had seen how this knowledge was already shaping him, making him more serious than other children his age, more aware of expectations and propriety. It broke her heart sometimes, this loss of childish innocence, but she also felt fierce pride in his grace and maturity. The ceremony moved toward its conclusion with the paying of homage. William rose from his seat, preparing to fulfill his role as heir to the throne. He would be the first to pledge his allegiance to the new king, setting the example for the other members of the royal family and the assembled peers of the realm. His heart pounded as he made his way forward, every step carrying him toward a moment he had both anticipated and dreaded. Kneeling before his father, William spoke the words of fealty that countless heirs had spoken before him. I, William, Prince of Wales, pledge my loyalty to you, and faith and truth I will bear unto you, as your liege man of life and limb. So help me God. His voice was clear and steady, betraying none of the complex emotions swirling within him. This was his father, the man who had taught him to fish, who had tried to comfort him after his mother's death, who had struggled to balance being a parent with being a future king. But this was also his sovereign, his king, the embodiment of an institution larger than any individual. Charles looked down at his son, his heir, the future of their family and their monarchy. For a moment the formal mask slipped and he was simply a father looking at his child with overwhelming love and pride. He placed his hands on William's head in blessing, a gesture both ceremonial and deeply personal. When William rose and returned to his seat, Catherine saw that his eyes were bright with unshed tears. The ceremony concluded with a grand recessional, the newly crowned king and queen processing out of the abbey, to thunderous organ music and the cheers of the congregation. The royal family would follow in order of precedence, with William and his family near the front of the procession, Catherine gathered her children, making final adjustments to their appearance, ensuring they were ready to face the cameras once more. As they began their own procession out of the Abbey, following the King and Queen at the prescribed distance, Catherine was struck by how different the atmosphere felt now compared to their arrival. Then everything had been anticipation and nervous energy. Now there was a sense of completion, of having crossed some invisible threshold into a new era. Her father-in-law was no longer the Prince of Wales but the King. Her husband was no longer the grandson of the monarch but the son. And her son George had moved one step closer to his own eventual destiny. The transition from the hushed reverence of Westminster Abbey to the explosive energy of the crowds outside was jarring. As William and Catherine emerged with their children, they were immediately engulfed in a wall of sound. Cheers, applause, the singing of the national anthem, the ringing of church bells across London, all blending into a cacophony that seemed to shake the very air around them. The sun had risen higher during the hours they had spent inside, and now London was bathed in warm spring light that made the city sparkle. The crowd stretched in every direction, a sea of humanity that seemed to have no end. Union Jack flags waved frantically, camera phones were held high to capture every moment, and people shouted greetings and congratulations with voices already hoarse from hours of cheering. George blinked against the sudden brightness, momentarily disoriented by the shift from the Abbey's dim interior to the brilliant daylight. Charlotte immediately spotted a group of children near the barriers waving frantically and instinctively waved back, her smile genuine and warm. Louis, who had been remarkably well behaved during the long ceremony, seemed to get a second wind from the crowd's energy, bouncing on his toes with renewed enthusiasm. The gold state coach awaited King Charles and Queen Camilla, its gilded splendor catching the sunlight and throwing dazzling reflections across the surrounding buildings. Built in 1762, the coach had carried monarchs to and from their coronations for over 2 centuries. It was an impractical vehicle by modern standards, uncomfortable and slow-moving, but its symbolic value was immeasurable. Charles and Camilla climbed aboard, settling into the plush interior, visible through the large glass windows that allowed the crowds an unobstructed view. William and his family would travel in the Australian state coach, a more modern vehicle but still magnificently ornate. As they made their way toward it, Catherine kept a careful eye on all 3 children, ready to catch Louis if he stumbled on the steps, or to adjust Charlotte's cape if it caught on anything. The journey back to Buckingham Palace would take them along the same route they had traveled earlier, but everything felt different now. They were no longer heading toward a ceremony but returning from one, no longer anticipating history but having witnessed it. The procession began with military precision. Thousands of military personnel lined the route, their uniforms pristine, their bearing immaculate. The household cavalry, with their distinctive plumed helmets and cuirasses, sat atop horses that had been groomed to perfection. Military bands began to play, their music carrying across the crowds, adding to the festive atmosphere. This was British pageantry at its finest, a display of tradition and discipline that few nations could match. Inside their coach, the Wales family settled into their seats. The interior was luxurious but not particularly spacious, and with 5 people crowded inside, personal space was limited. Louis immediately pressed his face against the window, his breath fogging the glass as he took in the incredible sight of the masses gathered to witness this day. Charlotte sat with perfect posture, still conscious of the cameras that were surely trained on their vehicle, capturing their every movement. George sat between his parents, and Catherine felt him lean slightly against her as the coach began to move. The adrenaline that had sustained him through the ceremony was beginning to fade, and the exhaustion of the long day was setting in. She wrapped an arm around his shoulders, a gesture of comfort and support, not caring if the cameras caught it. He was still her little boy, regardless of his royal status and future destiny. The crowds along the route were even larger than they had been during the morning journey. People had emerged from pubs where they had been watching the ceremony on television, adding to the masses already lining the streets. The atmosphere was jubilant, celebratory, with an energy that felt almost palpable even from inside the coach. Street vendors moved through the crowd selling commemorative flags, programs, and souvenirs. Somewhere in the distance, church bells continued to peal, their joyful sound adding to the symphony of celebration. William watched the crowds with mixed emotions. He loved seeing his father finally receive the recognition and celebration he deserved. Charles had worked tirelessly for decades, championing causes long before they became fashionable, dedicating himself to public service even when the media ridiculed his efforts. But William also understood that this day marked another step in his own inexorable journey toward the throne. Each transition brought him closer to the moment when he would be the one in that gold state coach, wearing that crown, bearing that burden. Catherine sensed his mood shift and reached for his hand. They had perfected this silent communication over their years together, able to read each other's emotional states with barely a glance. She gave his fingers a gentle squeeze, reminding him that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. That had been their promise on their wedding day, and every day since had reinforced that commitment. The procession made its way past landmarks that had witnessed countless royal ceremonies over the centuries. Trafalgar Square, with Nelson's column standing sentinel, was packed with people who had claimed their spots before dawn. The Mall, that grand approach to Buckingham Palace lined with Union Jack flags, stretched before them like a red carpet. The Victoria Memorial, with its golden figure of victory, gleamed in the sunlight. As they approached Buckingham Palace, the crowds reached a crescendo of excitement. This was where the traditional balcony appearance would take place, where the newly crowned king would show himself to his people, where the family would gather for photographs that would be reproduced in newspapers and history books for generations to come. The palace itself looked magnificent, its Portland stone facade clean and bright, the royal standard flying high to indicate the monarch's presence. The coaches passed through the palace gates, and suddenly they were enclosed in the relative quiet of the palace forecourt. The noise of the crowds became muffled, held at bay by the tall iron railings and the security presence. Staff members stood ready to assist with their disembarkation, their faces professional, but unable to completely hide their excitement at being part of this historic day. Catherine helped the children out of the coach, making sure everyone's formal wear had survived the journey intact. Charlotte's headpiece had shifted slightly, and she carefully repositioned it. Louis's collar had come askew, and she straightened it while he squirmed impatiently. George needed no adjustment. He had remained almost perfectly still throughout the journey, his natural tendency toward orderliness and propriety serving him well. They were ushered inside the palace, into the relative coolness of its grand corridors. Palace staff moved with practiced efficiency, guiding various members of the extended royal family to their designated areas. There would be a brief respite before the balcony appearance, time to use the facilities, to have a quick drink of water, to catch their breath before facing the crowds once more. In a private room set aside for their use, Catherine finally allowed herself to relax slightly. She slipped off her shoes for a moment, flexing her feet that had been confined in formal footwear for hours. William loosened his collar, rolling his shoulders to relieve some of the tension that had built up during the long ceremony. The children collapsed onto sofas, their formal composure finally giving way to childish exhaustion. But the day was not yet over. Through the windows they could hear the roar of the crowd gathered in front of the palace, chanting for the royal family to appear. The balcony appearance was a tradition that dated back generations, a way for the monarch to show themselves to their people, to receive their cheers and well wishes, to demonstrate the connection between crown and country. A palace official appeared at the door, giving the signal that it was nearly time. Catherine quickly helped the children into their shoes, smoothing down their hair and straightening their formal wear one more time. William adjusted his uniform, checked his appearance in a mirror, and took a deep breath. This final public appearance would be broadcast around the world, analyzed and discussed for days to come. Every gesture, every expression, every interaction would be scrutinized. They made their way through the palace corridors toward the famous balcony, joining other members of the royal family who would appear alongside the king and queen. The placement on the balcony had been carefully planned weeks in advance, with consideration given to hierarchy, family relationships, and the visual composition of the group. As direct heirs, William and his family would stand close to the king and queen, a visible representation of the line of succession and the continuity of the monarchy. The noise from the crowd outside grew louder as they approached the balcony doors. Catherine could feel the vibration of thousands of voices through the very walls of the palace. She glanced at her children, checking their emotional state one final time. George looked pale but determined, his jaw set in a way that reminded her achingly of William. Charlotte was alert and composed, though Catherine could see the tiredness beginning to show around her eyes. Louis was still bouncing with residual energy, though she knew he would likely crash completely once they were finally home. King Charles and Queen Camilla took their position at the center of the balcony. Charles still wore his crown, its weight both literal and metaphorical pressing down upon him. But his face showed joy and relief now that the ceremony was complete, now that he had finally assumed the role he had been born to fulfill. Camilla stood beside him, regal in her own crown and robes, her expression one of quiet satisfaction. William positioned himself to his father's right, with Catherine beside him. George stood in front of his parents with Charlotte and Louis flanking him. The placement was deliberate, showcasing 3 generations of the monarchy, the continuity from grandfather to father to grandson. Other family members filled in the remaining spaces on the balcony, creating a tableau that would be reproduced in countless photographs. The balcony doors opened, and the sound that greeted them was overwhelming. 100,000 people had gathered in front of Buckingham Palace and stretching down the Mall, all cheering, waving flags, celebrating this moment of national unity and tradition. The roar was deafening, a wall of sound that seemed to have physical force. Catherine felt it wash over her, felt the emotion and energy of the crowd, and despite the exhaustion of the long day, she felt her spirits lift. King Charles raised his hand in the traditional royal wave and the crowd's cheers intensified. He smiled broadly, clearly moved by the outpouring of support. Beside him, Camilla waved as well, her expression one of genuine happiness and perhaps some relief that they had successfully navigated this momentous occasion. William and Catherine joined in the waving, their movements synchronized from years of joint public appearances. George, following his father's example, raised his hand in a careful wave, his movements precise and controlled. Charlotte waved with more enthusiasm, clearly delighted by the sight of so many people gathered to celebrate. Louis waved frantically, with all the uninhibited joy of a 5-year-old, occasionally pointing at things in the crowd that caught his attention. The family stood on the balcony for several minutes, allowing the photographers time to capture their images, giving the crowd time to take in the sight of their royal family united in this moment of celebration. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of military bands could be heard, still playing ceremonial music. Church bells continued to ring across London, their joyful peals carried on the spring breeze. Catherine looked out at the sea of faces, the waving flags, the obvious joy and celebration, and felt a complex mixture of emotions. There was pride certainly in her family, in her husband, in her children who had handled this difficult day with such grace. There was gratitude for the support shown by the public, for their willingness to embrace this new era of the monarchy. But there was also a touch of melancholy, an awareness of the relentless passage of time, of her children growing up in the public eye, of the future that awaited them all. Beside her, George stood very still, his young face serious as he gazed out at the crowd. Catherine wondered what he was thinking, what he made of all this ceremony and celebration. Did he feel the weight of expectation? Did he understand what this day meant for his own future? She hoped that despite everything, despite the pressure and the protocol, he would find joy in his life, would discover purpose and meaning in the service he was being raised to provide. The traditional flypast began, the red arrows streaking across the sky in perfect formation, trailing red, white, and blue smoke. The crowd's cheers reached a new peak as everyone looked upward, watching the aircraft paint the British colors across the clear spring sky. Louis jumped up and down with excitement, pointing at the planes, his earlier decorum finally giving way to childish enthusiasm. Charlotte laughed at her brother's antics, while George's face broke into a genuine smile, the first unguarded expression Catherine had seen from him all day. William felt something loosen in his chest as he watched his children's reactions to the flypast. They were still children, capable of wonder and joy, not completely consumed by the weight of their positions. He and Catherine had worked hard to preserve their childhood as much as possible, and moments like this reassured him that they were succeeding, at least partially. The flypast concluded, and the family remained on the balcony for a few moments longer, savoring this final public moment of the day. Then with a last wave to the crowd, they began to withdraw back into the palace. The balcony doors closed behind them, muffling the sound of the crowd, returning them to the relative quiet of the palace interior. Inside, the formal composure finally broke. Louis immediately complained about being hungry and tired. Charlotte slipped her hand into her mother's, suddenly seeming much younger than her years. George asked quietly if he could please take off his formal collar, and William helped him with it, ruffling his son's hair affectionately once the stiff fabric was loosened. King Charles appeared, having removed his crown and heavy robes, looking more like himself again rather than a crowned monarch. He embraced William warmly, no longer king to heir but simply father to son. He bent down to greet his grandchildren, listening patiently to Louis's excited chatter about the plains and the crowds, smiling at Charlotte's more composed recounting of the day's events, squeezing George's shoulder with particular affection and understanding. Catherine watched the family interactions with a soft smile. This was what mattered ultimately, not the crowns or the ceremony or the public spectacle, but these connections, these relationships, this love that bound them together through all the challenges their unique position presented. As the afternoon wore on and they prepared to return to Kensington Palace, Catherine reflected on the day. It had been historic, certainly, a moment that would be remembered and discussed for generations, but it had also been profoundly human, filled with nervous children and emotional fathers, with the universal experiences of family dressed up in extraordinary circumstances. The drive back to Kensington Palace was quiet, the children finally succumbing to exhaustion, dozing against their parents. William and Catherine sat in comfortable silence, hands linked, processing the day's events. Through the car windows they could see that Londoners were still celebrating, gathered in pubs and parks, reliving the ceremony, discussing the fashion choices, debating the significance of various symbolic elements. When they finally arrived home, the children were carried to their rooms too tired to protest bedtime despite the early hour. Catherine helped them out of their formal wear, hanging the precious garments carefully for palace staff to collect later. She tucked each child into bed, dropping kisses on foreheads, whispering words of pride and love. Alone at last in their private sitting room, William and Catherine finally allowed themselves to fully relax. William poured them each a drink and they sat together on the sofa, Catherine's head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, painting the London sky in shades of pink and gold. They had witnessed history today, had played their part in a ceremony that connected them to centuries of tradition. But more importantly, they had supported each other and their children through a challenging day. They had upheld their duty while protecting their family, had served their country while preserving their humanity. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, new public appearances to navigate. But tonight they were simply William and Catherine, parents who had successfully guided their children through an overwhelming day, partners who had supported each other through another milestone in their extraordinary lives. The crown could wait. The future could wait. For now, this quiet moment together was enough.